Lep dober večer vsem skupaj. Bienvenido. Es un placer que estás aquí con nosotros en Ljubljana, Juan Gabriel. Digo estas palabras solo en castellano, solo para que se sientas como a casa. Y la continuación vamos a hacer en inglés. ¿Sí? Now for the beginning, we'll start with the very boring part. I have to introduce you. So I will tell a couple of facts. We know how it is with facts. Usually facts, especially facts of artists, of writers, are being told in order to hide something or to arrange or to create something that almost goes into fiction. So I'll do it very dry. Juan Gabriel was born in the most beautiful year of all years. I'm saying this because we are born at the same year, 1973, in Bogotá, in Colombia. He studied law first in Bogotá, and then he moved with his family to Europe, to Paris, and they lived in Belgium, in Barcelona, between that, I've heard yesterday, in India. And in 2012 he returned back to Colombia. Basically he lives there now. As I said, he studied law and later Spanish literature. He made a PhD in Spanish literature at the Sorbonne, yes, if I'm not mistaken. He has 5 official novels. I say official because he has written 2 novels before. The smart websites say those 2 you regard basically as less important, but the 5 are much more important. The Informants, Los Informantes, Secret History of Castaguana, Historia Secreta de Castaguana, El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer, The Sound of Things Falling, which appeared in 2011. It is this book that you can also buy there over. It is the first book of Juan Gabriel translated into Slovenian in a very beautiful translation, I have to say, of Kristina Koritnik and Tina Podržaj. It's an extremely important novel, and we'll hear much more about it later. Las Reputaciones in 2013, and the last book, which appeared just a couple of months ago, La Forma de las Ruinas, The Shape of Ruins, in 2015. Now, for the book El Ruido de las Cosas al Caer, the Sound of Things Falling was awarded with a very prestigious Alfaguara, Premio Alfaguara Prize, and the International Dublin Literary Award, among others. And you wrote also essays, biography of Joseph Conrad, who appears prominently also in this book. You were writing for the newspaper El Espectador from Colombia and others. So first, Juan Gabriel, I was really curious about your law studies. We know that law implies a very specific use of language. It is basically, the ideal of law is perhaps really to define things as much as possible, so no unclear spots can be found, basically.
Yeah.
How was this important experience for you as a writer, and what's the difference between the language of law and the language of literature?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you all very much for being here. It's a pleasure to be here in Slovenia. Thank you, Aleš, for doing this. It is true, you shouldn't trust facts about writers' lives, particularly if you find them online. The other day I learned that I was living in New York. I didn't even know that, but it must be interesting, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. I went to law school. This was a decision that I made when I was very young. Mostly because I come from a family of lawyers. There's a tradition of lawyers in my family. And growing up, even though I already knew, I have always known since I was 8 that I wanted to write, that my destiny was literature. I grew up at a moment and a place and in a family in which you couldn't just raise your hand and say, I'm going to write novels for a living. That was not easy to do. So I kind of talked myself into the idea that literature was a hobby. It was a pastime. And so I would be, like many people I knew, I would be a lawyer who wrote in his spare time. And right in the middle of my studies, I realized that the truth was quite the opposite, that literature was not a hobby for me, it was not a pastime, it was a vocation, it was a way of being in the world, a way of understanding the world, of interpreting the world. And that the novels I read played a much more important role in my life than I had allowed until that moment. So what I realized was that I should finish law school and then go and try to become a writer, which is what I did. This is when I chose to travel to Paris. When I was 23, as soon as I got my diploma, I gave it to my father and I said, you put this in a drawer and never talk about this again.
How did he react?
Well, he was, I must say, my family has always been very supportive, mainly because I think they understood that they had force-fed me novels since I was a little boy, so they had little room for complaints afterwards. But of course, nobody reacts too nicely when a son or a daughter says, I'm going to write novels. If my daughters said to me, we want to become writers, I would try to change their minds as soon as possible. But they didn't. They were very supportive, and this is what I ended up doing. Traveling to Paris to study literature as a pretext for trying to become a novelist. Now, if you know Latin American literature, you know that this is a huge cliche. It's the young Latin American writer-to-be who goes to Paris to try to become a novelist. It's something that we have done since the beginning of time. It's almost as if Paris were built for Latin Americans to go there and become writers. This is what Garcia Marquez did, Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, Carlos Fuentes, they all went to Paris. Even the great Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío arrived in Paris in 1900 to try to be recognized as a poet by the Parisian critics. So this is an old tradition. I was just following that cliche, following in the footsteps of all these writers that I admired. I completely forgot about my law studies at that moment. And since then, I have realized that the practice of law is all about judging and then absolving or condemning somebody. I think in that sense, novel writing is completely the opposite. Novels are that beautiful space in which we hold back our tendency to judge and replace it for curiosity and understanding. Novels are the space in which we can sympathize with a murderer for 500 pages, like Raskolnikov. In the field of law, we would be quick to judge and condemn Raskolnikov. That would happen in about 10 pages. But novels are the place we go to, not to judge, but to understand. And this is beautiful. This is, I think, one of the great things fiction does. So in a way, there are opposite ways of looking at the world, the way of a lawyer and the way of a novelist. And you were right before, language is very different. Language in law doesn't admit ambiguity. Language in a novel is ambiguous almost by nature, because novels don't, or at least the novels I like to read, don't give answers. They try to pose the most interesting questions possible, the most complex questions possible. This is something that Chekhov used to say. The role of literature is not to solve problems, but to present the problem, to present the question, not to give an answer. So in many ways, yes, there are two very different ways, opposite ways of looking at the world, the way of a lawyer and the way of a novelist. But this is something I realized much later. And what happened, ironically, is that the world of law professors, the world of the university, or rather the place I went, the university I went to when I was studying law, have become the setting for my books. And the narrator of this book is a professor of introduction to law, who one day, just a block from my university, gets wounded by a stray bullet. His life changes, and that's what the whole book is about. So, yeah.
Still, I mean, law, in an ideal sense, it has to believe in an equilibrium in the universe. It has to believe that justice can be found and done.
Yeah.
If writing novels, is it also finding justice for the unjust?
Very good. I could take 3 or 4 days to answer that question. I don't know. I think in many ways, writing novels is about just shedding light into the darkest aspects of our human nature, or the darkest places in that thing we call our history. One of the basic reasons I ended up writing this novel is because I had grown up. The novel deals with the to generalize in a very gross way. The novel is about those years in Colombia in which we lived under the war. There's no other way for it. The war declared by Pablo Escobar, the famous and infamous drug dealer, against the Colombian state and Colombian citizens. I grew up in a city besieged by bombings and shootings and the murder of politicians. And during a whole decade, all I knew was that the bombings and the statistics, the amount of policemen killed, and the images of bombed airplanes and bombed shopping malls and bombed public buildings. So we grew up with this wealth of material about this, about the public side of terrorism in those years. But at some point I began to ask myself, where do you go to learn a little bit about the invisible side? Where do you go to try to find out what those years did to us internally, to our emotions, to our morality, for lack of a better word, to our soul, right? How did those years, whose public visible side is very much available on the internet, you can go on YouTube and find the video of a presidential candidate being murdered, being shot in public. That's the public side, but what happened to us in our private side? What happened to the invisible side? What were the moral, the emotional consequences of all that? So in a sense, that's my answer to your question. That novels are about telling what only novels can tell. And this means going to those places that are not accessible for historians or journalists and trying to tell about what goes on there. This is what I try to do with a novel. Try to explore the consequences for these characters of living through these years of unpredictable violence, of fear, which changed each and every one of us. The thing is, I didn't know how. How did they change us? And this is the question I try to explore in the novel.
Just to describe it briefly to all the public who haven't read the novel yet, it's a beautifully written, very complex novel that traces back basically a history of violence that wasn't that at the beginning, let's say, in the late 30s when the novel starts, by remembering. But the basic story is really analyzed, is put about Antonio Yamara, this professor of law who lives quite a, what should I say, life apart of the everyday violence that is basically present everywhere in Bogota, and meets at a soccer pool billiard Ricardo Laverde. And one day Ricardo Laverde is being shot and he's being severely wounded, and this changes his life. And then he starts to remember back, basically he starts tracing back answers for the questions you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can hear the beginning of the novel, yes.
Yes.
Now read by you, and a couple of pages later, an excerpt read in Slovenian. So the public, you won't hear the same text in Spanish and in Slovenian, just to be clear. Juan Gabriel will read a beautiful beginning where hippopotamus that escaped from the private zoo of Pablo Escobar is being shot, and this basically, like Magdalene of Proust, starts a process of memory, very intense memory of the main character, and later on we'll hear an excerpt that is also set at the beginning and brings us back into everyday reality of Colombia in the 90s, 80s and 90s.
Yes. Okay. Can I just ask briefly how many of you understand Spanish? Could you raise your... Okay. Okay, good. So this is the beginning of the novel. El primero de los hipopótamos, un macho del color de las perlas negras y tonelada y media de peso, cayó muerto a mediados de 2009. Había escapado 2 años atrás del antiguo zoológico de Pablo Escobar en el Valle del Magdalena, y en ese tiempo de libertad había destruido cultivos, invadido abrevaderos, atemorizado a los pescadores y llegado a atacar a los sementales de una hacienda ganadera. Los francotiradores que lo alcanzaron le dispararon un tiro a la cabeza y otro al corazón, con balas de calibre .375, pues la piel de un hipopótamo es gruesa. Posaron con el cuerpo muerto, la gran mole oscura y rugosa, un meteorito recién caído. Y allí, frente a las primeras cámaras y los curiosos, debajo de una ceiba que los protegía del sol violento, explicaron que el peso del animal no iba a permitirles transportarlo entero, y de inmediato comenzaron a descuartizarlo. Yo estaba en mi apartamento de Bogotá, unos 250 kilómetros al sur, cuando vi la imagen por primera vez, impresa a media página en una revista importante. Así supe que las vísceras habían sido enterradas en el mismo lugar en que cayó la bestia, y que la cabeza y las patas, en cambio, fueron a dar a un laboratorio de biología de mi ciudad. Supe también que el hipopótamo no había escapado solo. En el momento de la fuga lo acompañaban su pareja y su cría, o los que en la versión sentimental de los periódicos menos escrupulosos eran su pareja y su cría, cuyo paradero se desconocía ahora, y cuya búsqueda tomó de inmediato un sabor de tragedia mediática, la persecución de unas criaturas inocentes por parte de un sistema desarmado. Y uno de esos días, mientras seguía la cacería a través de los periódicos, me descubrí recordando a un hombre que llevaba mucho tiempo sin ser parte de mis pensamientos, a pesar de que en una época nada me interesó tanto como el misterio de su vida. Muchas gracias.
We've heard about the extent of violence that was present at that time. Ricardo Laverde is a pilot with a young family, and he sustains it basically with flying drugs over to the United States, and one moment he's being caught and imprisoned for 20 years. He has a small daughter who is asking, "Where is my father?" and the mother, Maya, replies basically, "He's dead." One can really read out of your novel how culture of social lies emerges in times of terror. How fear creates basically this false parallel reality. Is writing novels as you do, this kind of novels, do you see them also as part of a process of, let's say, disguising these lies?
No, no, but I see where you're going. I don't see novels as a way of protesting against anything, but I do see them as a way of exploring whatever memories our societies are trying to hide. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, one of the great things that literature has always done, mm-hmm. trying to prevent societies from forgetting the things that are uncomfortable. And memories related to the years of terrorism, to everything associated with drugs and the way they penetrated Colombian society, have always been uncomfortable for us. Nobody should be fooled by the fact that every day a new TV series comes out about the world of drug dealers. Because for the most part, these are sensationalist products designed precisely to do the opposite thing as a novel does. Whereas novels try to look at reality in the face and open our eyes in front of uncomfortable facts. Most of these new narratives, TV series or sensationalist pulp fiction or whatever, what they try to do is soothe us with the image of these larger-than-life characters who have beautiful women full of surgeries and lead conflictive and difficult, but ultimately very interesting lives in Miami and in big pink cars. reality is that those years are among the most difficult for us Colombians to talk about, to discuss, and to remember. Mostly because we all know that we, in a way, allow drug money to penetrate our society in a way that it hasn't in any country in the world. During the years of that difficult decade, from maybe 1984, when Pablo Escobar killed the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, until 1993, where he was killed himself, During those years, everybody knew that drug money had penetrated sports. Football teams were owned by drug dealers. It had penetrated politics. Pablo Escobar started his career as a representative in Congress. He was elected for that. He was not elected. He was a second line, runner, but he was elected within the party, let's say. Drug money penetrated the church. Every important institution in Colombian life was infiltrated by drug money. So today, 20 years after the death of Pablo Escobar, 23 years, we are still wondering how we let that happen. And the most profound attempts at answering that question are being made in literature. In novels that are very different from a literary point of view, such as Leopardo al Sol by Laura Restrepo. I think she has a novel translated into Slovenian. The novels of Fernando Vallejo, that, like Our Lady of the Assassins, which is translated in Slovenian. These are attempts at opening our eyes where most Colombian society would prefer to close them, and to discuss uncomfortable things. This is one of the great things literature can do.
So you mean really by opening one's work up to this very difficult process of going back into past, analyzing, memorizing.
Yeah.
Basically, you are changing the past.
No, but I think you are treating the past as something that that can be manipulated. Mm-hmm. One of the things that worry every Colombian novelist who deals with the past, like I do, is the fact that our societies and people in power in our societies, our governments, our the states, big institutions are constantly trying to rewrite our past, to impose on us a version of what happened. Right now, for instance, there are peace negotiations going on in Havana, Cuba, between the Colombian government and the Colombian guerrillas. This is a war that has been going on for 50 years. And one of the things being discussed, even if they don't realize it, is a version of these 50 years. What has happened in Colombia during these last 50 years? Nobody agrees on that. There's one version of our past according to the left-wing guerrilla, one version according to the right-wing paramilitaries, one version according to the government. The exact same thing happens with the years of terrorism in the 80s and 90s. We have yet to agree on one version of how did Pablo Escobar manage to put a whole country on its knees and to destabilize a democracy in such a way. But that's the public side. What the novel tries to deal with is, as I said before, the private side of the same thing. The idea of living in fear, the idea of living with unpredictable violence, the idea that I experience every day of coming back home in the evening with a little surprise. You know, I have come back. I am alive. I didn't see any bombings. I wasn't in any bombings. I wasn't a witness of a shooting. These things shaped our lives during those years. And I remember growing up used to the fact that, for instance, there were tape crosses on windows in private houses and in public buildings, designed to not to resist in case of a bombing, but to stop the window from shattering in too many dangerous pieces, rather than breaking up in 4 clear pieces that wouldn't hurt anyone. So this is the city that is described in the novel, a city that was used to living in fear, to taking precautions that you would expect more in a city at war than in a city just basically under attack from one single terrorist and his organization. When I was 20, a friend of mine was shot, much in the same circumstances as the character. And going with him to visiting him at the hospital, witnessing his recovery, the fever, the hallucinations, everything that we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Those things stayed in my mind so strongly that they ended up making part of the novel. And this is what the novel tries to deal with. That private side that nobody talks about, because what is known and what is important for other narratives, for the TV series, for the documentaries, is the public side, which is really readily available for everybody. So these are the things that I try to remember.
I read your novel also as a kind of contemporary Bildungsroman, the German word.
Yes, yes.
Novel of formation of man, basically, because the main character, Antonio Amara, he lives a nice life, having sex with students, going out to parties, being a young professor, making thesis about very artificial or not down-to-earth cases.
Yes.
And then this happens to him, and it really changes his life. And through going through this deep process of finding out the truth, finding out the memory, he becomes someone completely else.
Yeah.
Now, on one hand, I remember sentences in the book where you say very beautifully, what should we do with all these memories of ours? They are basically hindering us in our everyday life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on the other hand, this is just the equilibrium help to growing up in a way.
Yeah, it's very important what you say about the investigation of a certain kind of truth. This is what he does, and this is something that I love finding in novels, and maybe it's because of that that my novel has taken the shape of an investigation. What Antonio Yamada does essentially after he's shot is try to investigate who was the guy standing next to him, the guy that the assassins wanted to kill. He just got a stray bullet, but who was the guy standing next to me? And who was obviously responsible for this happening to me? This is what he asks himself. So the whole novel is an investigation into somebody else's life. And I've always loved those books. Think of The Great Gatsby, for instance, if you have read it. Think of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Books that are investigations into somebody else's life that end up giving me a big truth about my own life. I've always loved when that happens in literature, and this is exactly how my novel is built. It's an investigation into the mystery of somebody else's life, but an investigation that takes place because the detective, Antonio Yamara, has realized that learning the truth about that other life will give him the truth about his own life. Which is, in some measure, what happens at the end of the novel. We won't say how. He's killed at the end. No, it's not true. But in the end, there is some measure of truth that he acquires about his own life, which is a kind of Bildungsroman. So I think you're quite right. It's an education. It's an emotional education. Es una educación sentimental, a sentimental education, yeah. I don't think he's a very nice character, at least in the beginning. But as the novel progresses, I think you learn to see his flaws, and he learns to see them, and he learns in a way how to deal with them, or at least he is able to confront the truth about his own life, but most importantly about the impacts of his country's history on his own life.
And his country's history is told in several ways. The most astonishing and most beautiful way in the novel is the history of aviation.
Yes.
Perhaps you can tell something about it.
Yeah.
Coming from Bogota, which lies 2,600 meters high, altitude and aviation are very strong metaphors in this.
It is, yeah, they are. Yeah. Thank you for noticing that. Yes. What happens in the novel is that this character, Ricardo Laverde, the pilot who smuggles marijuana into the United States at the beginning of the 70s and then moves on to cocaine, like many people did. He is the grandson of a war hero. Colombia fought a war against Peru, our neighbors to the south, at the beginning of the century, in the 1930s. And it became for me very interesting to realize that the same activity that at the beginning of the century was a metaphor for everything that's good. Pilots were the ones who won this war against Peru. It is widely recognized by Colombian historians that pilots were the real heroes of the war. They won the war. So this same activity of flying planes that at the beginning of the century was the symbol of patriotism, of heroism, everything good in that present moment in Colombian history, at the end of the century have become the metaphor of the worst thing that had happened to the country, which was drug trafficking and its consequences. So it became evident for me that you could tell the history of the 20th century in Colombia through planes. This was a discovery I made after a plane accident started taking up a lot of space in the novel and becoming very important in the plot of the novel. There's a moment at the beginning of the novel in which a plane crashes into the Colombian mountains. This was an actual accident that happened in 1995 when an American Airlines plane coming from Miami to the Colombian city of Cali crashed into the mountains, into the Andes, and killed 104 passengers. 4 of them survived. This incident is important in the novel because when the characters meet, when Antonio Llamara meets Ricardo Laverde, one of the first things they do is go to listen to a recording. Now, Antonio Llamara doesn't know what Ricardo Laverde is listening to. He is sitting in front of him with his earphones on, so Antonio Llamara doesn't know what he is listening. As it turns out, in the novel, he is listening to the black box of that airplane in which somebody was killed, somebody that he loved very much. The actual transcription of that black box is the first document I found when I started writing the novel. It might very well be the origin of the novel. Finding this document in which you can read the voices of the pilots who are about to die, crashing onto the Colombian mountains. This was a terrible and fascinating document for me to find. At that moment, I knew that I would eventually do something with it. So you see, the novel is full of planes. There are planes coming from the war with Peru, and the novel narrates an accident that had to do with one of these pilots in real Colombian history. The novel deals with that American Airlines flight. The novel deals with the planes used by Ricardo Laverde as a drug smuggling pilot. And in a way, this was an arch to tell the story of the Colombian 20th century, the activity of flying planes became the perfect metaphor, mostly because those planes can fall down. And this was initially the sound of things falling. The title of the novel comes from that scene in which one character is listening to this plane falling down and crashing. This is where the title comes from.
I'd like to ask you a question about writing and control, because a novel as this is an extremely complex organism with many details that have to be crafted very precisely on one hand, and here really everything comes through a very complex structure together. But on the other hand, and I think this is a great force of this, is that me as a reader, I sense while reading that the person who wrote it had a direction, but wanted to discover unpredictable, so to say. Is this feeling?
Very good. Yeah. Yes. You feel that?
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah. Okay. Yay. Yeah, that is exactly the case. I was telling a journalist before today in one of the interviews I gave about a quote I love to remember, or rather an idea that is often discussed by one of my favorite novelists, Spanish novelist Javier Marías. He says there are two kinds of novelists: those who work with a compass and those who work with a map. So if you work with a map, you know everything that you will find in the journey. You know where the rivers are, and the bridges, and the walls, and the mountains. You know exactly what you will find during the journey. If you work with a compass, you only know that you want to go north, but you have absolutely no idea of what you will find during the journey. I work with a compass. I know vaguely where I want to go, but a very important part of me tries hardly not to know too much. And a very important part of my work is to allow the novel and the characters certain breathing space to discover discover many things. Discover what the destiny of characters is, but also discover what the novel is about. This is, I think, one of the things that happen when you write novels this way, that it's only through the writing of the novel that you realize what you're writing about. It took me, for instance, 150 pages to realize that I was writing about fear. That one of the main themes in the novel was the recurrence of fear and the way we learned in my generation to deal with this feeling. I didn't start the novel knowing that I would write about this feeling and that fear would become a theme, but it was rather something that I discovered as I wrote. Now, this is a very uneconomical way to write, because this means that you can write 100 pages and then realize in page 101 that everything you've written is worthless because you've just discovered the real novel that you were meant to write. And you have to throw away 100 pages and a year worth of work. But at the same time, I think that the act of discovery that a novel is, for me, turns into an act of discovery on the part of the reader. I hope that the reader feels he is treading into unknown territory, which is exactly what it feels like for me when I write. Writing novels, as I said before at the beginning of the conversation, is for me about shedding light on dark places. This means going to those dark places which I have never been to before and trying to come back with the news. This is, I think, one of the reasons Joseph Conrad is so important for me. His best known novel is Heart of Darkness, and it is both literally and metaphorically a journey into unknown, uncharted territory. I think every novel that I like, at least, is in a way a journey into the unknown, traveling with the writer to places we have never visited, where we don't know what awaits us. And that sense of discovery, of reality, the human condition, the past of my country, everything being a dark place, full of mysteries, full of secrets, is what gets me going as a novelist. That sense of surprise. So it's you're quite right in saying that.
Since there's also another dimension, which is the way you write corresponds very nicely with the way of the main theme, at least I read it that way, of the novel, the complete unpredictability of life.
Yes. Yeah, obviously. Well, that became one of the big things of the novel, because it was one of the first ideas that came to my mind when I started remembering those years. You must understand that when I left Colombia in '96, I almost completely stopped thinking about terrorism. It was almost as if it never happened to me. I don't know if it was a defense mechanism, voluntary amnesia, but between the moment I left in '96 and the moment I began writing the novel in 2008, I could safely say that not once did I think about those years, the years of the bombings and the killings, etc. These were memories that I suppressed, that became too uncomfortable to think about, and it was only through the writing of the novel that I started asking questions. First of all, remembering myself, and then asking questions to other people who had witnessed the same thing or who had been through the same years, to try to find out if what I remembered was correct. This was the act of discovery, trying to deal with these hidden memories in a way I had never done before. So in that sense, the novel is also, and it was also that act of discovery, of exploration of my own hidden feelings.
Yesterday we talked a bit privately, and you said there was Quixote and then there was magic realism. Now, the great Latin American authors known here in this country tended very often to describe the lives of dictators.
Yes.
Now, in your novels, the novels of, let's say, younger generations, very often drug traffic barons like Escobar are becoming the focus, let's say, the central point. So, because also that's where the centers of violence.
Yes.
I was thinking about this phenomenon when I was reading that when now Guzman, the Chapo, was recently again recaptured.
Yeah.
That, I mean, he was living almost as a monk in his cell.
Yes.
So there was nothing of this Miami Vice fancy surrounding, no private zoos, nothing.
Yes.
And he was reading Saviano 000, a book about himself.
He was.
Basically, that was the book.
That's a great detail. You should put that in the novel.
I think, I mean, the world is dramatically changing.
Yeah. Well, I think if this is where you were going, I think that in a way, drug lords are the new dictators. What Latin American dictators were to the generation of Vargas Llosa, Garcia Marquez, Carlos Fuentes, probably the mafias, the drug wars, and everything that surrounds the drug wars, everything that the drug wars include, is for us, for my generation, it represents that. It represents the dictatorships, the totalitarianisms that the last great generation of Latin American writers wrote about. I don't know if you knew this, but there's an anecdote in which the four, I think it was just the four big names of the Latin American boom gathered together: Carlos Fuentes, Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, and the fourth chair is sometimes occupied in this anecdote by Julio Cortázar, other times by José Donoso, the Chilean writer, and they gather up and they agree to publish, each one of them, a novel about a dictator, so that the whole thing could be read as
a book.
As a big book on Latin American dictators. Garcia Marquez did it, Vargas Llosa did it, Augusto Roa Bastos from Paraguay did it, but the one who came up with the idea, Carlos Fuentes, never did it. Anyway, this just goes to show that this figure of the omnipotent man was a source of interest and fascination for that generation, in the same time that these larger-than-life drug lords are for us. We still don't understand how somebody like Pablo Escobar could exist. Yeah. And probably El Chapo Guzman will also generate his own fictions to understand such a figure and the role he has played in Mexican violence and instability during the recent years. So I think that has become a source of fascination for us in the same way that dictators were for the last generation. I hope we can write novels as good as theirs.
I would like to open up the space for 3 questions. Okay?
Yeah.
3 questions. Is there anyone interested?
But first of all, could I just thank you for this wonderful conversation and ask for a round of applause for our moderator.
Questions, please. It's a unique opportunity.
I would really like a question, if I may. First of all, thank you for visiting Slovenia. My first question would be, would the book be written if Pablo Escobar were still alive, and you would be in Colombia? Or because the theme was fear?
Yeah.
Would that?
Yes.
You would?
Yes, the book would have been written even if Pablo Escobar was alive and I was living in Colombia. Not only because I think literature has always been a compulsion and almost a vice for me. It's something I cannot avoid doing. And both as a novelist and as a columnist, I have always felt that if you write something and you don't bother at least one person, it wasn't worth writing in the first place. But there's another reason, less courageous. My friend Laura Restrepo, a great novelist, a great Colombian novelist, but also a great journalist, began in the 80s doing some research about the drug cartels in the north of the country. That research was intended to go into a TV show, a documentary film about drug cartels. When the drug dealers learned this, they sent somebody to call Laura Restrepo and basically threaten her. They said, if you go on with your TV show, you will suffer the consequences. And Laura, who's a very courageous woman, had the nerve to ask, okay, I will stop my TV show, but can I write a novel? And the drug dealer said, yeah, sure, go ahead. Nobody reads novels anyway. So I will be safe.
Thank you.
Another question?
Well, thank you very much. You've all been very kind for your attention. It was a lovely evening. Thank you.
You can come here. Juan Gabriel is willing to send books. And please, enormous applause for Juan Gabriel.